Good morning, subscribers. Geekonomics back again with the next in the series on externalities. So yesterday I did the negative production externality, which you all know is all to do with supply. Today we're having a look at negative consumption externality. So I'm now assuming that we all know what an externality is, so I'm not going to go into that too much. But what I will say is that because we are now talking about consumption rather than production, when we're talking about consumption, we are therefore talking about demand rather than supply. And if you can get that into your mind, then it does make the drawing of this particular diagram, which we'll come on to shortly, does make the whole drawing, annotation, etc. so much easier. If you just think consumption is demand and production is supply. It's a very straightforward thing, but sometimes people often forget that and find these diagrams difficult. So, the example that we're going to consider today, ladies and gentlemen, is the playing of a very loud rock music. Now, like me, you may not think I'm a bit of a rocker, but believe you me, ladies and gents, back in the day, I love nothing more than, and still to this day indeed, love nothing more than putting that album from 1987, probably the best album ever produced, Appetite for Destruction, Guns N' Roses, and just cranking that up to number 10 and maybe jamming along on the old Gibson Les Paul. Well, that is because I get a lot of private benefit from that. However, if you were my neighbour, you probably would not enjoy that quite as much as me, unless you are a real avid rock fan. And so consequently, my private benefit will be much bigger than the benefit to the general area. You'll know this if you've got noisy neighbours, or maybe if you've got a neighbour who is practicing and learning to play the drums. They get a lot of benefit from that themselves, but it imposes a cost upon society, the neighbours, which means that actually the benefits to society are much lower until they turn into some sort of rock god. The benefits to the wider society are much lower. So as with marginal social cost, which we looked at yesterday, MSC equals MPC plus MEC, I'm sure you'll remember, the marginal social benefit is made up of two components. Number one, the individual's private benefit, or the firm's private benefit. But remember, our definition of externality here is that the production, or in this instance consumption decisions by an individual, impose costs on third parties who are not involved in the production or consumption process. So for example, if I decide to play my guitar, well, that's my decision, not my neighbour's decision. And so my neighbours bear the cost, even though they've got nothing to do with my decision-making process. So the marginal social benefit is equal to my private benefit plus some type of external benefit. Now that might be a positive benefit, or in this instance, if it's a nuisance, a noise nuisance, then that of course is a negative benefit. But once again, ladies and gentlemen, on the diagram that we're about to draw, we're looking for the point at which marginal social cost is equal to marginal social benefit. That is the optimum position, the socially optimum equilibrium for society. MSC equals MSB. Okay, let's jump to the diagram now. So because we're talking about demand here, I know therefore that we need two demand curves, because one of them is going to be my private benefit curve, and one of them is going to be my social benefit curve. So straight away, I know that I can put on to this particular diagram two benefit curves, or two demand curves if you will. And I also know that I'm going to have the one marginal social cost curve in this instance, the one supply curve, because in this analysis, unlike the production analysis, we're focusing on demand rather than supply. Okay. If we have a negative consumption externality, that means that there's too much of this activity going on. There's too much drum playing, there's too much guitar playing, there's too much loud music playing. So consequently, we need to look to the point where we have the highest level of output, which is of course here. And so at this equilibrium here, where we have this curve, I'm not going to say what it is at the moment, but where that intersects with the marginal social cost curve, that is obviously yielding the highest level of output. In other words, that is the point at which we're getting too much consumption of rock music in this instance. So we're going to call that Q1, we can call that P1, and because the individual is only taking into consideration their own private benefit and consuming too much, then we know straight away that this is the marginal private benefit curve. Now, for this to be acceptable to everybody in the neighbourhood, neighbours alike, then really the consumption of rock music, guitar playing, needs to be lower, and it needs to be here. This would be the more allocatively efficient point. You may recall that we used that term yesterday. So Q2 and P2, and so we need to be moving from an equilibrium A to an equilibrium of B, because this line now, we can see that this demand curve, if this is private benefit, then this one must be the social benefit, and therefore point B must be our socially equilibrium optimum level of output. Now, as with the diagram for negative production externality, with the negative consumption externality, we also need to show the examiner where the deadweight welfare loss is in terms of the cost being imposed upon society. And you'll recall that I said in the previous video, to find that out, you go first of all to the inefficient level of output. So that's Q1 here. And we take a dashed line up, and we've got a point there, and we've got point A. So I'm going to label this third point, point C. Okay, now, why is that important, point C? Well, you can see at this level of output, here we've got our marginal social benefit curve. Here we've got our marginal social cost curve. So at a level of output Q1, A, which is on the marginal social cost curve, is much, much bigger than C, which is the marginal social benefit curve. In other words, costs are greater than benefits. The MSC are much greater than the MSB. Consequently, there is an external cost being imposed upon society. Now, as we move more towards this allocatively efficient level of output, you can see what happens. So if we were operating, say, here, this level of output, Q3, for example, then this would be the social benefit, this would be the social cost, and whilst cost is still greater than benefit, the gap is starting to narrow. And as we move along, I'll not sort of labour this point, but you can see that it gets smaller, 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 until they're equal at this point. And that's the point at which we need to get to. So, for all these points beyond Q2, we can see cost greater than benefit, cost greater than benefit, cost greater than benefit. And so that triangle, ladies and gentlemen, once again, is the deadweight welfare loss of the social cost which is being imposed upon society as a result of the overconsumption, in this instance, of rock music. And again, as I said on the previous video, if you think of this as like ABC triangle, if you think of, there it is there, A, B, and C, it's pointing in this direction. And so it's pointing you to the socially optimum level of output, which is at point B, and that's where we need to get to. Now, we'll go in another video, we'll talk about how we get to this particular point. And a final thing to say, I guess, is we know that this is the equation here, MSB equals MPB plus MEB. Well, we know here that this is MSB, we know that this is MPB, and so the distance between the two, so that distance A to C, there, that is obviously our marginal external benefit. Not benefiting everybody, of course, because this is not yielding this socially optimum level of output. This is, if you're the neighbour of this particular person, you're not particularly getting the external benefit there at all yourself as the third party. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that's sufficient for this particular diagram. So I'll be back again. Next one we'll have to do will obviously be, we'll have to do the positive. So we'll be doing positive production externality and positive consumption externality. Bye for now.